the startup. So last time I did a chess video, I did it to try out the sounds a bit. This time we'll do it to give you a little help if you want to learn chess. So we're going to start from the absolute basics, how the pieces move, how do they set them up, and that's going to be it for today. So absolute 0 point today, and you can slowly start, and together with me hopefully start to learn chess a bit more, understand chess a bit more. That's the plan, and that all while making good sounds hopefully. A little disclaimer, I am not a chess teacher, and I'm also not a super good chess player. I am decent, I'd say, probably a bit above average, but that's it. So I am not an absolute mastermind. I'm just an ASMR artist who wants to use chess as a tool to make you tingle and maybe have you learn a bit of chess as well. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get into it. I have my chessboard here. It's a little old. It has a few marks on it from playing, of course, and the pieces are also, some of them still have a little cushion thingy below them, but you'll see that in a minute. I have my pieces over here, and we'll just get them out, and we'll start with the simplest. Maybe not the simplest, we start with the lowest of pieces, I'd say. So this is a pawn. Now, if you clicked on this video for ASMR purposes, you probably know what a pawn is already. And if you click on it to learn chess, this is the pawn. It has the least worth out of all the pieces, as long as it is still a pawn, which is most of the game. But as soon as the pawn reaches the other side of the board, you can decide whatever other piece you want. So if a pawn reaches the other side of the board, you usually want to make it a queen, because that is the most valuable piece. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. So all of your pawns, you have 8, one row of pawns in front of the rest of your pieces, and all of your pawns start on the 2nd or the 7th rank. So the 2nd if you're white, the 7th if you're black. And I'm gonna set up all the pawns if I find them all, because I don't want to just throw the pieces all onto the board, because that would make a lot of noise. So still missing 3 pawns and one last pawn. Oh, perfect. So these are your pawns. Pawns can usually move 1 step forward. That's it. Usually you can only move 1 step forward. And if you hit something else, for example, if there is an enemy piece, and whatever piece it is, if you're in front of it, you cannot move forward with the pawn. That's it. This pawn is now stuck. You can't move it until this piece is put away somewhere, then you can move again. So the pawn moves 1 step, 1 step, 1 step. Now there are 2 exceptions actually. So the first exception is your very first move with a pawn. So these pawns are all on the 2nd rank, and I'm white, so none of them have moved yet. So my very first move with a pawn is, or can be, to put the pawn up 2 squares. It is allowed to put this pawn up 2 squares, 2 squares, 2 squares, 2 squares, 2 squares, 2 squares. That is just the very first move. The very, very, very first move. You can put the pawn up 2 squares. By the way, I hope you can see that. So if you do that, the other person's, of course, it's the other person's turn, and then in the next move you can again put a pawn up 2 squares, or you can also put it up 1 square. You can decide that for the first move, if you want to move it up 2 squares or 1 square. That is the first move of every pawn. Now the second exception is let's say this is black, and you move this. Now both pawns are opposite of each other, and none can move. So none of those pawns can move. But if there is a pawn diagonally to you, or diagonally in front of you, then you can what's it called? Oh my god, capture the pawn. You can capture the pawn. So if there's just two pawns on the board, and they are both diagonal to each other, then either of them can hit the other pawn, or capture the other pawn. It's not hit, it's capture. You can capture the other pawn. And that way you can capture pawns. And as I said, everyone starts with 8 pawns. And 1 pawn is worth 1 point of material, okay? 1 point of material. Okay, of course, also everyone needs a king. The king is, on one hand, the most important piece of the chessboard. On the other hand, it has very limited movement. Let me just find the white king. I think it's somewhere at the bottom. God damn it. That looks like a king. So, if you had only kings on the board, like this would be a stalemate. So, nothing could ever happen, and I'm going to explain why. These are both of the kings, of course, the opposite colors. And one king can always move into all directions, but only one square. So it can go one to this side, one diagonally, and the same goes for every other direction. But it can only move one square per turn. And that's about it for the king. The other king, of course, can do the same. And one square into each direction. But there are a few rules that are also about the king. So, for example, a king can never move into a spot where it could be attacked or it could be captured. For example, we learned that the pawns can capture diagonally. So if the king was here and your king was here, the king is in front of the pawn. It can't be captured by the pawn right now, but it can't move there because now it could be captured by the pawn. So that's not possible. So if you are the king, the black king in this position, you can move backwards to every square backwards because there you can't be hit again. And you can move there because there's also no one that can capture you. But you can't move here because the pawn could capture you. And you can't move here because the king could capture you. So, you only have these 4 square lefts out of the 8 squares that you could go to. And that's really all about the king. It's not too difficult, is it? The king starts on the square, on the column E. So if you look at the chessboard, it has numbers on the side and letters on your and the opponent's side. And the king always starts on the E file, okay? E file. And both sides start with their king on the E file. And now, the pawns would be set up in front of the king. Like this. And of course black would have the same. Now let's get to the next piece, which is the bishop. The bishop is a very useful piece, as all the pieces, but it is a very useful piece as in it is able to move across the board in comparison to all the pieces we had so far. The bishop can move diagonally and go as long as he wants. So you have two bishops. one of the bishops starts out on a white square, and one of them starts out on a black square. And these bishops can never leave their color because they can of course only move diagonally. Let me just move those two away again. So these bishops can only move diagonally, but they can move as far as they want as long as there's not a piece there blocking it. So for example, if there is a pawn here, the bishop cannot jump over the pawn, it can only move next to the pawn. But other than that, it can move however it wants. And same for the white bishop. As long as there's no piece blocking it, it can move wherever it wants on the white squares diagonally. Not too difficult, is it? Next up, we have the rook. Now you have two rooks as well as bishops, and these rooks are similar to bishops in that they can move across the whole board, but they don't move diagonally. They move horizontal and vertical. So, are those the right words? I'm not so sure about that. They can move across the rows and columns. And it's the same with the bishop. They can't jump over pieces, but other than that, they are free to move wherever they want. And what is a plus for rooks compared to bishops is that they are not bound to a color, because if they move across rows and columns, they can move across every column or every row. That is also why the rook is worth more points of material than a bishop. A rook is worth 5 points of material, and the bishop is worth 3 points of material. So that is the rooks. Now, the most valuable piece of your chess set, of course next to the king, because if the king is captured, you have probably lost. Next up is the queen. The queen is the most valuable piece, and it is worth 9 points of material, which is too much for me to show with one hand. So let me just 9 points worth of material. And the queen is a fusion of a rook and a bishop, so it can move like a rook, and it can also move like a bishop. If it moves like a bishop, of course, then it stays only on the color that it started out as. But as a rook, it can also move into other columns and other rows. So the queen is the most versatile. It has the most movement options, but it cannot jump over pawns or other pieces. So it is also bound by how many pieces are around it. So for example, if you have a setup that looks like this, now this is unrealistic, but if you have a setup that looks like this, you can only move the queen up to the pawns but not jump over them. Once again, you can't jump over other pieces with your own. But other than that, this is a fusion of a rook and a bishop, and worth 9 points. Next up, if you look at the setup for white, there's still 2 free spots, and those are the 2 horses. 2 little horses, and oh, that's a black one. That is a white horse. They are actually not called horses, they're called knights, but they're horses, okay? So the 2 knights, they are a bit special because they have, again, limited movement, as in limited range-wise. So if you want to move a horse, a knight, you have to move it 2 to the front and 1 to the side. That's how a horse moves. 2 to the front or to the back, 1 to the side. You choose one direction, one direction. Back, straight back. Wait, that's not one direction. Oh my god. You choose one direction. So for example, you go to the left, and then you can go 1 into either direction that has a 90-degree angle. So to the right, you go 2 to the front, and 1 to the left or to the right, or to the right. You go 2 back, and then 1 to the left or 1 to the right. So that is how the horse moves. So horse is a bit more complicated than maneuvering all the other pieces, because movement is a bit restricted. Of course, the horse is not bound to one color like the bishop is, but to move a horse, you have to often use multiple turns. So, for example, if I have a horse here, but I want to move it there, you have to use multiple turns to get there. But horses do have a plus side. That makes them the same worth as bishops. So if you are set up like this, and maybe this, normally you couldn't, if you can't jump over pieces, you couldn't move anywhere, because everywhere you'd want to go is a piece. But knights are special in that they are allowed to jump above pieces, so this is a valid move. You can just jump above other pieces, and that counts for your pieces as well as for enemy pieces. So knights are allowed to jump above other pieces, and therefore knights are also worth 3 points, the same as bishops. And that is the whole chess set that you need to know. Now if you look here, I hope you can see it. You probably can't, because my camera setup has its flaws, but if you want to set up your chessboard, you start out with a row of pawns in the second row. So the pawns are all in the second row, or in the 7th row if you're black. Then you put the king on the e-file, and the queen next to the king in the middle of the board. So the board has 8 squares in both sides. So it's, what's the word? It's a rectangle. It's a square, and it has 8 squares that make up this big 64 square. You put the king in the middle of the board on the e-file, and you put the queen next to the king on the d-file. Those are both in the middle. Next to the king and the queen on both sides, you put the bishops. Next to the bishop, you put the knights. And next to the knights, you put the 2 rooks. And that is how you set up a chessboard. And then you do the same for the other side, which I'm gonna do now. So, we already have the king, and we have 1 pawn in front of it. Now next up, we have the queen. And we have all the pawns, of course. We have all the pawns. Still 3 pawns left. Two pawns left. And the last pawn is also the last piece in this wonderful little thing. Anyway, so now you have all the pawns in front of your king and your queen, and next to the king and the queen come the bishops. Then next to them come the horses, and then next to them the 2 rooks, and that is how you set up a chessboard. Maybe this way you can see it a little bit better, but probably not. So you have white on one side, black on the other side. White starts with 1, 2, and black is on 7 and 8th rank. You have the letters behind your lines. King starts on E, queen starts on D on both sides. So kings and queens are both opposite to each other. And then next to your royals, you have the 2 bishops. You have then the 2 knights, and then come the rooks, and that is your chess setup. And then you can start to play, and how you play, or what moves you should do in the beginning maybe, or how you can checkmate your opponent in certain situations. That's all stuff that we will come to later on, that we will talk about in future chess ASMR videos. Hopefully, if you like this video, then please let me know if you want to learn more about chess. I am very glad if you do, and we will definitely look more into it. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you found this helpful, and most important of all, relaxing.